"You called the police on the woman who owns this house?" Officer Ben Ramirez asked, and for one terrible second, no one on the porch moved. Margaret Whitmore stood perfectly still in the thin mountain light, one hand resting on the doorframe her late husband had sanded and stained himself more than 30 years earlier, while her daughter-in-law, Ashley, folded her arms as if she had already won. The cabin sat high above the tree line outside Asheville, wrapped in cold October air and the smell of pine, the kind of place people drove for hours to rent on holiday weekends, not the kind of home they imagined an old woman might have to defend from her own family. But that morning, Margaret was not thinking about the view, or the gold leaves blowing across the gravel drive, or the first frost that had silvered the railings. She was thinking about the sentence Ashley had just spoken in front of 2 deputies, a neighbor across the road, and Margaret's own son. "She doesn't belong here anymore." Daniel Whitmore stood 2 steps behind his wife, jaw tight, eyes lowered, as if silence could excuse him from what was happening. That silence cut Margaret more deeply than Ashley's sharp voice ever could. Ashley had always hidden her ambition behind bright smiles, careful compliments, and little offers to help, especially after Richard Whitmore died, and everyone assumed Margaret might become easier to move, persuade, or manage. Over the past year, Ashley had started calling the cabin the family property in a tone that suggested Margaret was merely borrowing time inside it. First it was small things. Rearranging kitchen drawers. Changing which room was called the guest room. Talking about renovations Margaret had never approved. Then came the bolder steps, the clipped comments about maintenance, the gentle suggestions that a woman nearing 70 would be better off somewhere easier, somewhere flatter, somewhere closer to town. Somewhere else. Margaret had listened. Margaret had noticed. And Margaret had said very little. That was why Ashley had made her mistake. She believed quiet meant weakness. She believed grief had made Margaret slow. She believed legal ownership could be replaced by family pressure, by a son too cowardly to interfere, by the performance of certainty in front of strangers. So Ashley had picked her moment carefully. A Friday morning. A claim that Margaret was refusing to leave. A call to the sheriff's office framed like a simple domestic removal. Clean. Fast. Humiliating. Ashley had expected Margaret to panic. Instead, Margaret had opened the front door herself and invited the deputies onto the porch with the calm dignity of a woman greeting church visitors. Even now, with Ashley standing there in a cream sweater and expensive boots better suited for a boutique than a mountain driveway, Margaret's face remained composed. But beneath that calm, something old and steady had hardened into resolve. This cabin was not just lumber, stone, and deed paper filed downtown. It was the last place on earth where her life still made sense in its original shape. Richard's coffee mug still hung on the hook by the stove. The hallway wall still bore the pencil marks from Daniel's childhood growth chart. The cedar chest at the foot of Margaret's bed still held every letter Richard had ever written her. And now Ashley had invited the law to witness her greed. Officer Ramirez looked from Ashley to Margaret, then down again at the document in his hand, and the wind seemed to stop moving through the pines. Because in that moment, before anyone said another word, Margaret knew the balance had shifted, and Ashley, for all her confidence, had no idea the mountain home she was trying to take had just become the place where she would finally be exposed. Ashley recovered first, and when she did, her voice came back sharper than before, as if volume alone could outrun the truth spreading across that porch. She stepped closer to Officer Ramirez and pointed toward Margaret with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment in her head too many times to imagine it failing. She said there had to be some mistake, that the house was meant for Daniel now, that Margaret had agreed to move months ago, that everyone in the family knew it. But the more Ashley spoke, the more strange she sounded, and the more obvious it became that she was stacking assumptions where facts should have been. Officer Ramirez did not argue with her. He simply asked one quiet question after another, and each one seemed to pull another loose thread from the story she had tried to stitch together. When had ownership changed? Where was the recorded transfer? Who had authority to remove the resident? Had there been any court order at all? Ashley glanced at Daniel then, not like a wife seeking comfort, but like a woman silently demanding backup from the only person still weak enough to give it. Daniel finally lifted his head, but instead of sounding certain, he sounded tired. He said he thought the cabin was supposed to become his eventually. He said his father had talked for years about keeping it in the family. He said Margaret had been struggling alone up there, and they were only trying to help. The words floated into the cold air and fell flat. Because everyone on that porch could hear the distance between helping someone and calling the police on her. Margaret watched her son as though she were seeing him from very far away. He looked older than his 42 years that morning, not because time had been hard on him, but because cowardice had. There was a softness in him as a boy that Richard used to protect, a gentleness Margaret once thought would make him kind. Instead, life had turned it into something flimsier. He had become the sort of man who let stronger personalities decide what was acceptable, then told himself he had chosen peace. Ashley filled every silence he left behind, and for years he had mistaken surrender for harmony. Margaret had seen that truth in pieces, but never as clearly as she saw it now. The neighbor across the road, Mrs. Donnelly, had drifted closer to her mailbox by then, pretending to sort envelopes that had already been delivered the day before. Her presence embarrassed Ashley, which pleased Margaret more than it should have. Ashley cared deeply about appearances. She liked sympathy when she could gather it, admiration when she could stage it, and social standing when she could wear it like a tailored coat. What she could not tolerate was looking foolish in public. Officer Ramirez handed the deed back to Margaret with both hands, a gesture so respectful it seemed to reset the entire balance of the morning. Then he said, in a tone stripped of all uncertainty, that this was Margaret Whitmore's legal residence, and no one had authority to remove her from it. Ashley's face changed. Not dramatically. Not enough for a stranger to notice. But Margaret saw the exact second the smugness cracked and calculation rushed in to replace it. Ashley was no longer trying to win cleanly. She was trying to survive the embarrassment. And Margaret, still standing in the doorway of the home she had kept standing through every season for more than 3 decades, realized this humiliating little performance had only revealed the beginning of what Ashley had been planning all along. For a long moment, nobody on the porch seemed sure what to do next. The deputies had made the legal position clear, yet the air still carried the stale shock of Ashley's failed performance, as though the morning itself had not caught up to the truth. Margaret could see it in the way Ashley's chin remained lifted a little too high, in the way Daniel kept shifting his weight on the gravel, in the way even Mrs. Donnelly had stopped pretending to sort mail and was now openly watching from across the road. Shame had arrived, but it had not settled evenly. Ashley wore it like irritation. Daniel wore it like fear. Margaret wore none of it at all. She stood with one hand on the doorframe and the other relaxed at her side, as if she had been expecting this exact moment for much longer than anyone realized. Officer Ramirez asked whether there was anything else the deputies needed to know before they cleared the call. Ashley answered before anyone else could, insisting that there had been a misunderstanding, that she and Daniel had only been trying to help Margaret with next steps, that emotions had run high, that families sometimes handled things badly. It was a cleaner version of the morning, polished in a hurry, and it might have sounded almost believable if not for the fact that she had tried to remove an elderly woman from her own home in front of witnesses. The second deputy, a younger woman named Officer Reed, took a slow look around the porch, then at the suitcases Ashley had placed near the railing. 2 medium-sized roller bags and a cardboard box sat there like evidence of a decision Ashley had already made on Margaret's behalf. That small detail changed the mood all over again. Officer Reed asked, very plainly, who had packed those bags. Ashley hesitated. Daniel swallowed hard. Margaret answered in the same calm tone she had used all morning and said that she had not packed anything and had not agreed to leave. The words landed harder than shouting would have. Suddenly the scene no longer looked like a family disagreement. It looked planned. Margaret could feel the truth shifting into place for everyone present, not all at once, but steadily, like sunlight moving across a floor. Ashley had not simply misread paperwork. She had prepared for removal. She had expected witnesses, authority, and momentum to do what honesty could not. Daniel finally tried to speak, but his voice came out weak and overcareful. He said Ashley had gotten ahead of herself. He said nobody meant any harm. He said they only thought it was time to make practical arrangements before winter because the mountain road could get rough once snow started coming in. Margaret turned to look at him then, and the sadness in her face made him stop. She knew that tone. It was the same tone he had used as a teenager when explaining a dent in the truck, a failed class, a broken promise. He always spoke as if the real problem were not the choice itself, but the unpleasantness of having to discuss it afterward. Margaret had spent years protecting him from consequences, then years pretending that was love instead of damage. Standing there now, she saw the final shape of what indulgence had grown into. Ashley might have been the engine of the scheme, but Daniel had supplied the permission. He had watched her talk about his mother like unwanted furniture, and instead of drawing a line, he had stepped aside and called it practicality. Officer Ramirez said the matter was closed and reminded them that any dispute over future property rights would have to be handled through proper legal channels, not intimidation, not assumptions, and certainly not a false removal. Ashley nodded tightly, but Margaret saw the look in her eyes. It was not surrender. It was retreat. And as the deputies turned toward their cruiser and Daniel stared down at the gravel like a scolded child, Margaret understood something with perfect clarity. This had not been a moment of madness. It had been a test. Ashley had wanted to see how much of Margaret's life could be taken before anyone stopped her. Now she had her answer, and Margaret intended to make sure she never forgot it. The patrol car disappeared down the gravel road, leaving behind the kind of silence that did not feel peaceful so much as exposed. Ashley did not move toward her own car. Daniel did not step forward to gather the suitcases that should never have been on Margaret's porch in the first place. They both stood there beneath the sharp blue mountain sky as though they were waiting for the scene to rearrange itself into something less humiliating. It did not. Margaret looked at the cardboard box, then at the 2 roller bags, and finally at her son. She asked him, in a voice so calm it forced him to listen, whether he had known Ashley packed them before they arrived. Daniel took too long to answer. In that pause, Margaret learned more than any confession could have told her. He said he had seen the bags in the back of the car that morning, but assumed Ashley was trying to motivate a difficult conversation. He said he did not think she would actually go that far. Margaret almost smiled at that, not from humor, but from disbelief. Men like Daniel always claimed surprise at the exact outcome they had helped make possible. Ashley, sensing that his explanation was failing, snapped that none of this would have happened if Margaret had simply agreed to what was reasonable. There it was again, that word. Reasonable. Ashley used it the way some people used manners, as a polished wrapper around selfishness. In her version of events, it was reasonable for a widow to step aside, reasonable for younger people to decide what came next, reasonable for sentiment to yield to convenience, reasonable for the woman who had kept the cabin standing through storms, tax bills, repairs, and grief to hand over the keys because someone else had grown tired of waiting. Margaret stepped fully onto the porch then and let the screen door close softly behind her. Ashley stiffened, perhaps expecting anger at last, perhaps hoping for it. But Margaret had reached a place beyond anger. Anger would have given Ashley something dramatic to push against, something she could later describe as instability, proof of why changes had been necessary. What Margaret offered instead was far worse for her. Clarity. She said she wanted the truth, not another soft lie built to protect Daniel from discomfort. She wanted to know when this plan had started. Ashley looked at Daniel again, but he still would not meet his mother's eyes. So Ashley answered for both of them. She said it started after Christmas, when they came up for the weekend and found Margaret carrying firewood by herself. She said the driveway was icy, the stairs were steep, the grocery trips were too much, the distance from town was impractical, and the cabin was wasted on one person. She said they had talked about how much easier life would be if Margaret moved into a condominium near Hendersonville, somewhere smaller, somewhere manageable, somewhere appropriate. Margaret listened without interruption. Ashley mistook that silence for weakness once again and kept going. She said Daniel had every right to think ahead because one day the property would be his responsibility anyway. She said families had to make hard decisions before age made them unavoidable. Then she made the mistake that finally stripped all pretense from her argument. She said, with a quick, frustrated wave of her hand toward the house, that places like this belonged with people who could use them properly. The words hung in the cold air between the three of them, plain and ugly. Not safer, not easier, useful. That was what Ashley believed life was for. Homes, people, grief, memory, all of it measured by whether it still served her idea of the future. Margaret felt something inside her settle into certainty. She had spent the better part of a year noticing the missing respect, the subtle rearrangements, the way Ashley touched things as if rehearsing ownership. Now she finally saw the full design. This had never been about concern. It had been a long, patient campaign to make Margaret feel temporary in the one place that still held the shape of her real life. Daniel rubbed a hand over his mouth and said maybe they should all calm down and talk later. Margaret turned to him then, and the disappointment in her eyes was quiet enough to make him flinch. She told him later had already arrived. The plan had been packed into suitcases, driven up the mountain, and handed to law enforcement in broad daylight. There was no later that could soften what that meant. Ashley crossed her arms, but the confidence had drained from her posture. She was no longer facing an old woman she believed could be pushed aside. She was facing a witness who had finally stopped making excuses for her. And as the wind moved through the pines and lifted a few brittle leaves across the porch boards, Margaret understood that the morning had changed something more permanent than legal standing. It had ended the last illusion she had about the people standing in front of her. Daniel looked as though he wanted the ground to open beneath him, but Ashley still had enough pride left to mistake Margaret's quiet for hesitation. She picked up one of the roller bags and set it upright with a small, irritated thud, and said they were all tired, all emotional, and all saying things they would regret. It was an attempt to turn betrayal into misunderstanding, to smooth over a deliberate humiliation with the language of family stress. Margaret did not let her. She stepped down from the porch onto the gravel, feeling the cold firmness under her shoes, and for the first time that morning she allowed herself to look directly at the home, as if seeing it through Ashley's hungry eyes. The fieldstone chimney Richard had built one summer with a borrowed mixer and a bad shoulder. The wraparound porch he had widened after Margaret said she wanted enough room for 2 rocking chairs and flower pots. The kitchen window above the sink where she had watched Daniel sled down the lower hill as a boy while soup simmered on the stove. Every board, every nail, every tax payment, every repair bill belonged to a life Ashley had entered only at the end, yet spoke of as if she were entitled to inherit the best parts without understanding what they had cost. Margaret said, very evenly, that she and Richard had bought the land when Daniel was 8 years old. It had been nothing but sloped ground, scrub brush, and one rough access road that washed out every spring. They had spent years building in stages because that was what their budget allowed. Richard worked overtime. Margaret took bookkeeping jobs from home, clipped coupons, delayed vacations, and stretched every dollar until it squeaked. There had been winters when they kept the thermostat lower than was comfortable because one unexpected furnace repair could throw off an entire month. There had been summers when they stained the deck themselves under 90-degree heat because hiring help would have meant postponing Daniel's orthodontist appointments. This house had not appeared out of convenience. It had been assembled from sacrifice, patience, and marriage in its most ordinary and honest form. Ashley shifted her weight, clearly impatient with the history, as if the past were only useful when it delivered her the future she wanted. Margaret noticed that too. Ashley had no reverence for what came before her, only appetite for what remained. Daniel finally said that no one denied what his parents had built, but that things changed, and practical decisions had to be made. Margaret turned to him with such steady disappointment that his words dried up halfway through the sentence. She told him practical had become his favorite word whenever he wanted to excuse a failure of character. It was practical not to argue with Ashley, practical not to upset anyone, practical not to defend his mother if doing so might cost him peace at home. But what he called practical was merely comfortable, and comfort had made him weak. Ashley opened her mouth, ready with another polished defense, but Margaret raised one hand and stopped her without lifting her voice. Then she said something neither of them had expected to hear. She said that Richard had seen this coming, not in its details, but in its spirit. After his heart scare 2 years before he died, he had insisted on reorganizing every deed, account, and instruction connected to the property. At the time, Daniel had laughed it off and called it morbid. Ashley had called it unnecessary. But Richard had called it protection. Margaret watched both their faces change at once. Whatever they had assumed about the future of this home, they suddenly understood there was more they did not know. And in the cold, bright stillness of that mountain morning, Margaret felt the first clear edge of something stronger than heartbreak. She felt prepared. Ashley laughed then, but it was no longer the polished, social kind of laugh she used at holiday dinners or charity lunches. It came out thin and brittle, the sound of someone trying to buy a few extra seconds with mockery while panic crept in around the edges. She said Richard had always been dramatic when it came to paperwork, that older people loved to act as if ordinary estate planning were some grand strategic move, that whatever documents existed could not possibly change what was obvious to everyone. She swept her hand toward the cabin, the porch, the wide slope of pines rolling down the ridge, as if beauty itself were an argument in her favor. She said a place this valuable should not sit in the hands of one aging woman rattling around up there alone. The words were out before she could soften them, and once they were out, she could not call them back. Daniel looked at her quickly, not shocked by the sentiment. Margaret noticed, only alarmed that she had said it so plainly. That distinction mattered. It told Margaret exactly how long this poison had been living inside their marriage, passing between them in private conversations, dressed up as concern, hidden inside late-night financial planning, whispered beneath the language of family responsibility. Margaret did not answer immediately. She let Ashley hear her own cruelty hanging in the cold air. Then she asked whether that was truly how Ashley saw her. Not as Daniel's mother. Not as the woman who had welcomed her into the family, given her Richard's mother's china for her first Thanksgiving as a married woman, watched her children when Ashley claimed work was overwhelming, lent money once without humiliating her when Daniel's business idea failed. Just an aging woman in the way. Ashley crossed her arms tighter and looked out toward the road, as if refusing eye contact could make her seem less exposed. She said that was not what she meant, but the correction came too late and sounded false even to Daniel. Margaret turned to him and asked the question she had avoided for months because deep down she had feared the answer. Had he been discussing the value of the property with Ashley before Richard was even buried? Daniel flinched so hard it was answer enough. Yet after a moment he admitted they had talked generally about the future, taxes, maintenance, and whether keeping the place long-term made sense. Margaret felt something inside her grow colder than the October wind. Richard had still been alive during some of those conversations, still climbing those stairs slowly, still trying to hide how tired his body had become, while his son and daughter-in-law were already measuring the house like investors standing on a lot. Ashley seemed to realize she had lost the softer ground entirely, because when she spoke again, she dropped the polished concern and let irritation speak for her. She said Margaret was being selfish, that people in their late 60s had no business managing mountain property alone, that Daniel had his own future to think about, that homes like this were supposed to move down to the next generation instead of being frozen in grief. There it was, the clean, hard spine of her belief. Not love, not care, transfer, convenience, inheritance delayed too long. Margaret looked at Ashley for a long moment and finally understood that the woman standing in her driveway did not hate her in any personal way. Hate would have required feeling. Ashley simply resented any human being who occupied space she wanted. Daniel began murmuring that everyone needed to calm down, but Margaret held up her hand and his voice died again. She told them both that Richard had not only updated the deed arrangements, he had also left written instructions with their attorney, along with specific letters to be opened if certain lines were crossed. Ashley stared at her. Daniel's face went pale in a way Margaret had not seen since childhood. Neither of them had expected Richard to remain present in the room after death. Yet there he was, not in ghostly sentiment, but in preparation, foresight, and the disciplined love of a man who knew exactly what weakness in the living could destroy. Margaret saw the fear in Ashley now, real fear at last, and she knew why. Because greed could survive embarrassment. It could survive conflict. But it had a much harder time surviving proof. Margaret did not need to raise her voice. By then, silence was doing more work than anger ever could. She looked at Daniel first, because he was the one who still had a choice to make, even after all the damage already done. She told him to go into the study, open the bottom drawer of Richard's old desk, and bring back the blue file folder with the brass clasp. Daniel hesitated, and Margaret could see the same old instinct moving through him, the childish hope that if he delayed long enough, someone stronger would rescue him from the truth. Ashley immediately cut in and said there was no reason to turn a family disagreement into some theatrical legal event, but Margaret did not even glance at her. She repeated the instruction to her son, and this time there was something in her tone that Richard himself used to carry when the matter was settled before the sentence was finished. Daniel went inside. The screen door creaked shut behind him, and for a few moments only the wind moved, pressing cool air down the slope and stirring the brittle leaves around the porch steps. Ashley tried once more to recover her footing. She said Margaret was making everything harder than it needed to be, that nobody had wanted a scene, that practical conversations became impossible whenever older people attached their identity to property. Margaret turned toward her then, finally giving her full attention. She said a home was not an object to the people who built their lives inside it. It held labor, sacrifice, memory, and the shape of a marriage. Only people who had never paid the true cost of something spoke so casually about taking it over. Ashley's expression tightened, not because she had been insulted, but because she had been understood. Daniel returned with the folder in both hands, as if it weighed more than paper should. Margaret recognized it instantly. Richard had placed it there himself 2 winters before his death after a long afternoon at their attorney's office in town. He had come home quieter than usual that day, not frightened exactly, but clear-eyed in a way that had unsettled her. He told her then that love was not only about what people wanted to believe about one another. It was also about preparing for what weakness, entitlement, or pressure might tempt them to do. Margaret opened the folder slowly. Inside were copies of the deed, trust documents, a letter from their attorney, and one sealed envelope with Daniel's name written across the front in Richard's firm hand. Daniel stared at that handwriting as though it had reached across the years to touch his shoulder. Margaret handed him the envelope. Ashley stepped forward, but Daniel moved back before she could take it. For the first time that morning, he did not look to her before deciding what to do. His fingers shook slightly as he opened it and unfolded the letter. He read the first few lines in silence, and the color drained from his face. Margaret did not need to ask what it said because she remembered every word Richard had spoken before sealing that envelope. If Daniel ever allowed anyone to pressure, displace, manipulate, or legally corner his mother in connection with the cabin, then his contingent future interest in the property would be revoked automatically and redirected to a preservation trust managed outside the family. Richard had not trusted good intentions. He had trusted structure. Ashley noticed the change in Daniel before she understood the cause of it. She asked what the letter said, but he did not answer. Margaret then handed him the attorney's letter, the one confirming that the trigger language had already taken effect the moment an attempt was made to force her from the home through intimidation or false legal pressure. Daniel's mouth parted, but no words came. Ashley reached for the papers anyway, scanning them faster and faster until her confidence began collapsing in visible stages. This was no future debate, no vague warning, no sentimental threat from beyond the grave. It was executed, binding, immediate. By trying to push Margaret out, Ashley had destroyed the very outcome she had been trying to rush into existence. The mountain house would not pass to Daniel under her influence. It had already moved beyond their reach. Margaret watched Ashley's face harden into stunned disbelief, then into something uglier, something desperate. But the moment had already turned. The greed that brought her there had finally collided with a man she could not charm, pressure, or out-talk anymore. Richard had planned for their weakness, and now his planning was standing on that porch as firmly as stone. Daniel lowered himself onto the porch chair as if his legs no longer trusted him. Margaret looked at her son, not with triumph, but with the sorrow of someone who had run out of reasons to pretend. Then she told them both, in a voice steady enough to echo, that some homes are lost long before the paperwork changes hands, and some people do not realize what they have thrown away until the door closes behind them. Daniel stayed in the porch chair with Richard's letter hanging loosely in his hand, staring at the paper as though reading it again might somehow change the meaning. Ashley did not sit. She could not. Her whole body seemed too charged with humiliation to be still. She paced once across the porch boards, then turned back toward Margaret with a look that was no longer polished or patient or pretending to be concerned. For the first time all morning, she looked exactly like what she had become in Margaret's mind. Cornered. Not wounded by injustice, but offended that strategy had failed. She said Richard had no right to set a trap like that, no right to punish Daniel for trying to plan responsibly, no right to lock family out of its own future over one emotional misunderstanding. Margaret let the words pass without interruption because Ashley's panic was stripping her cleaner than any accusation could. Every sentence made the same confession in a different form. She was not grieving a family rupture. She was grieving the loss of access. Daniel finally looked up and told Ashley to stop talking. The words were quiet, but they startled all three of them. Margaret could not remember the last time he had spoken to his wife with anything resembling firmness. Ashley stared at him in disbelief, as if betrayal only counted when someone else committed it. She asked whether he was really going to let his mother turn him against his own household after everything they had built together. Daniel laughed once, but there was no humor in it. He said that was the problem. They had built almost nothing together that did not rest on someone else making excuses for them. The business Margaret had quietly bailed out. The down payment help Richard had framed as a gift instead of what it truly was, a rescue. The babysitting, the holiday hosting, the countless small acts of support that Ashley had learned to receive as tribute rather than kindness. Margaret watched her son carefully then, because regret could look noble for 5 minutes and disappear by dinner time. But what she saw in his face was not performance. It was collapse. He had finally been forced to stand inside the shape of his own choices, and he did not like what he found there. Ashley's voice sharpened. She said Margaret had manipulated the entire family with grief, guilt, and old money. She said women like Margaret always acted fragile when they wanted sympathy and strong when they wanted control. She said no one had ever been able to say no to her without being made to feel cruel. That accusation might have wounded Margaret once. It did not now. It merely confirmed that Ashley had never understood the difference between generosity and ownership. People who benefited from another person's sacrifice often rewrote that sacrifice as control the moment gratitude became inconvenient. Margaret stepped toward the suitcases and lifted the cardboard box from the porch. With both hands. It was lighter than she expected. Ashley had packed it with framed photographs from the hallway, 2 sweaters from Margaret's bedroom closet, and a ceramic angel from the mantel that had belonged to Richard's mother. The carelessness of it struck Margaret more deeply than the insult. Ashley had not packed a life. She had packed symbols. Enough to suggest departure. Enough to make a scene look complete. Margaret set the box back down and told Ashley to take every item she had touched and put it back where it belonged. Ashley did not move. Instead, she said Daniel should contest everything, that attorneys could challenge trusts, that a dead man's fear should not dictate their future. Daniel rose slowly from the chair then and folded Richard's letter with deliberate care. When he spoke, his voice was low and exhausted. He said the future Ashley kept talking about had just shown him exactly what it would cost. Not only the house, not only the trust, his mother, his name, whatever was left of his father's respect. He said he had spent years telling himself he was keeping peace, when in truth he had been renting comfort with borrowed loyalty. Ashley's face hardened into something cold and almost unrecognizable. She said if he wanted to throw away his marriage over one bad day, that was his choice. Margaret noticed she did not say one bad decision, only one bad day. Even now, she believed the true crime was exposure. The mountain air had grown colder, and somewhere down the slope a dog barked once before falling quiet again. Margaret looked from her son to her daughter-in-law and understood that what stood before her was not a family argument nearing resolution. It was a reckoning separating into its final forms. Daniel still had a narrow road back to decency, though it would cost him more than apology. Ashley had already crossed into a place where remorse no longer seemed possible because entitlement had hollowed out everything softer. Margaret did not feel triumph. She felt clean. The confusion, the self-doubt, the months of wondering whether she had imagined the small, disrespectful moments had all burned away. What remained was simple. She had been right. Richard had been right. And the people who came to remove her from her own home were standing in plain sight, finally unable to hide from themselves. Margaret let the silence settle before she spoke again, because some truths deserved room to land. The mountain light had shifted by then, angling across the porch in long pale bands, touching the fieldstone chimney, the porch rail, the old rocking chair Richard used to claim every Sunday afternoon. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was the same anymore. Daniel stood near the steps with his father's letter still in his hand, his shoulders lowered in the quiet posture of a man who had finally stopped pretending he was confused. Ashley remained near the door of her car, rigid with disbelief, as if she still expected the world to reward certainty even after certainty had failed her. Margaret looked at them both and realized that the deepest injury of the morning was not that they had tried to push her out. It was that they had convinced themselves she could be removed so easily. That was the true measure of how little they thought of her strength, her memory, and the life she had built before either of them began planning how to inherit it. She told Daniel to put the photographs back inside, then take the suitcases and the box to Ashley's car. He obeyed without argument. That, more than anything else, made Ashley furious. She asked whether he was seriously doing this, seriously choosing humiliation over his own wife, seriously letting one legal document erase the reality of their marriage. Daniel did not answer right away. He carried the box to the car first, set it in the trunk, then returned for the bags with the slow steadiness of someone accepting each step as part of a debt long overdue. When he finally turned to face Ashley, he said this was not about one document. It was about a pattern he had refused to name because naming it would have required him to act. He said he had watched her turn generosity into entitlement, hospitality into access, and concern into strategy. He said the worst part was that he had helped her do it by standing still whenever standing still was easier than doing what was right. Ashley stared at him as though she no longer recognized the man in front of her. Margaret understood that feeling better than anyone. For months she had been looking at her own son and wondering when his spine had gone missing. Now she saw it returning, but not in any way that could undo the damage. Some awakenings come too late to save what mattered most. Ashley's face changed again, settling into something smooth and cold. She said if this was how he wanted it, then he could explain everything to the children, to their friends, to the rest of the family. She said people would hear her side too. Margaret almost pitied her then. Even now, Ashley believed narrative could outrun character. She believed appearances remained negotiable. Margaret stepped closer and said there would be no need for competing stories. She would tell the truth plainly if anyone asked. Ashley had called the police on the legal owner of the home. Ashley had packed another woman's belongings without permission. Ashley had mistaken patience for helplessness and grief for weakness. Nothing about that story needed embellishment. Ashley opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that day, she seemed to understand that explanation would not save her from fact. Daniel told her he would come back for the rest of his things later. Not today. Not with Margaret standing there. Later, after he had spoken to an attorney, after he had figured out how much of his life had been built on avoidance, after he had found the courage to face consequences without asking his mother to absorb them for him. Ashley gave one short, disbelieving shake of her head, got into the car, and slammed the door hard enough to rattle the loose leaves across the gravel. Then she backed out of the drive and disappeared down the mountain road without another word. The sound of the engine faded quickly, swallowed by distance, pine, and the old familiar hush of the ridge. Daniel remained standing there, smaller somehow, without Ashley's force beside him. He looked at Margaret and began to apologize, but she stopped him gently. Not because she did not want an apology, but because words had already done enough damage for one day. She told him that remorse mattered only if it changed the life around it. Then she said he should go. He nodded once, eyes wet but steady, and walked to his truck with the slow, deliberate steps of a man leaving more behind than a driveway. When he was gone, Margaret stood alone on the porch and let the quiet return. Fully, she looked out over the rolling trees, the long slope falling away into blue distance, the home she and Richard had built board by board, season by season, prayer by prayer. She did not feel victorious. Victory was too loud a word for what remained. What she felt was steadier than that. She felt restored. The house had not been saved that morning, because it had never truly been lost. What had been reclaimed was something far more important. Her place in it. Her right to stand there without apology. Her certainty that dignity, once defended, becomes stronger than fear. Margaret reached for the brass doorknob, stepped back into the warmth of the home that still knew her name, and closed the door on everyone who had forgotten it.